It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Nichole Lighthall, an associate professor of psychology at the University of Central Florida, an internationally recognized expert in decision-making, stress, and cognitive aging. Her research integrates behavioral science and neuroimaging to uncover mechanisms that shape resilience and vulnerability in aging. She has published extensively on risk-taking, stress reactivity, and adaptive decision-making, contributing critical insights to cognitive neuroscience and gerontology. In addition to her research, Dr. Lighthall is co-director of the Scientific Research on Network on Decision Neuroscience and Aging, SRNDNA. I have the privilege of co-directing with her.
Wait a minute, Kendra directs and I help Kendra. Let's be clear.
Not true. Okay, through SRNDNA, she fosters interdisciplinary collaboration to advance our understanding of how decision-making processes and resilience influences cognition, cognitive trajectories in later life. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nichole Lighthall.
And I just want to thank everyone for allowing me to come and join you. I've had already a wonderful visit. This is my first time in Dallas to UTD and provide a longevity. I'm a huge fan of so much work that happens here, and so I'm really honored to be able to join you. Before I begin, I just want to note, because this is being recorded in perpetuity, that I have funding from Air Force Research Laboratory, which I will not be discussing because it requires clearance that I'm not able to get and share with you due to government shutdown and other things. So I just want to make it clear that I am not including that data because I'm not allowed to. Okay, so to begin, I just want to share a little bit about the kind of scope of what we do in quick words. This is my lab-ish. There's more of them. We're estimating around 50 people each year. Lots of research participants contribute to the work that we do. And we study neurocognitive and contextual factors that determine value-based decision-making in adult development. So from everyday choices about food and socializing to major decisions in domains such as health, career, family, and finances, value-based decision-making shapes the direction and the quality of our lives. And more specifically, this is if we think about what is value-based decision-making versus something like perceptual decision-making, it's making choices between alternatives based on some kind of psychological subjective value. So I'm going to be discussing today a few of the things that we have worked on over the course of the years in my lab. A lot of what I did earlier on and even still do now considers everyday decision-making, common choices like purchasing decisions, and the different factors that go into those decisions on a day-to-day basis. Lately, though, we've been working a lot more in the space of trust-related decision-making. This is an epiphany that I had myself during the pandemic when I was sitting at home alone, working in my home office. I just had this concept that all of the decisions that we make that are of really true value that we consider to be high stakes and very important and life-altering in some form or fashion involve social context, social stimuli, or others in a fundamental way. And so this is something that I took on over the last 5 years. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about some new and emerging research in my lab on veracity decisions. So that is determining whether things are true or false, real or fake, involving technology, and especially in spaces that are involving new digital communication platforms like I'm on right now. I guess I'm being broadcast currently on Teams, which means that the people who are receiving me on the other side of this digital portal have some version of me, but it's different than the version that's here live with you in this room. And I want to understand how that impacts the way that people make decisions, especially involving social partners, and also different kinds of platforms for delivering information and decision making that might involve cyber crimes or other kinds of deception that's perpetrated online or uses online platforms, and how older adults make decisions that involve these kinds of digital technologies. So the central question of my lab that we're trying to address over these many years is how do biological aging and age-related factors, which a lot of times has nothing to do with the biological aging process, impact decision-making? And the central challenges that we try to tackle in this work, which is very complex, is that decisions have an array of features that are differentially impacted by age. They have different trajectories of change. And like I said, this phrase age-related is important because things that are age-related but are not based on aging itself have to do with things like cohort effects, life experience, and exposure. And so when we're trying to attribute the mechanisms that cause people to make different decisions, we need to be really careful about determining what has to do with aging, like a physiological process or something to do with the brain, and things that happen to co-occur with people of a certain age. So in doing that, the way that we have to get to this process of understanding mechanisms is we need to identify decision features and their neural correlates that have the greatest age-related change. Now, that's just my strategy, right? Like we can look at all different kind of features that decisions have, but my target is consider, based on prior literature, what we know about the brain, what we know about these contextual factors, and figure out where are we going to get the most bang for our buck that's going to determine the things that will make older people make different decisions than younger people, or maybe the same decision, but they process them in a different way. And then once we identify those probably important factors, we need to be able to isolate them in experiments and test for those age differences to see if our hypotheses are correct. One of the guiding neural models that we use in my lab to frame our research is the AIM framework, which is developed by Kendra's mentor, Samuel Larkin and Brian Knudsen at Stanford. So in this neural model of decision making and aging, they frame these three pretty, like we'll call this a pretty parsimonious model about stages of decision making that involve different neural substrates and how information flows through to impact decision behavior. So at the affect level, this is a signaling system that tells us about the balance of different choice options or possible outcomes. And it involves neurotransmitter systems in substrates that generate these neurotransmitters, including dopamine, serotonin, glutamate, and GABA. And those have different trajectories of aging. I actually know that you've had speakers in here recently talking about these neuromodulatory processes and how they affect decision making. And they also, these systems, the neurotransmitter systems, guide us in determining what we should be paying attention to. What are the key features of a decision space that we should really be attending to make our choice? A lot of the work that I've done has focused on the second stage, which is the integration stage. And this stage has, when all of the features of a choice context are coming together that we use to determine what the subjective value of a given decision is. So those are things like reward features, including the likelihood of certain outcomes, the valence of outcomes, the magnitude of outcomes, delays in outcomes, effort required to achieve outcomes. And also, and importantly, I think also for this group, because there's so many folks here working on learning and memory systems, this is where past experience coming from different memory systems is integrated into that process to inform the overall subjective value of the choice options at hand. And the motivation phase is the transition from the internal process to the actual behavioral action. And so I will admit that's not a space we've done a lot of work. So primarily I have focused my work on the integration phase. So I'm going to take you through three phases in this talk. As I said, kind of coming through the way that I've been working through these problems in my career. So we'll start with research on everyday decision making that we've done in the context of human aging. And that will primarily focus on the impact of age-related changes to learning and memory systems that's asymmetrical, different memory systems changing at different rates, their neural substrates biologically changing at different rates, and how that impacts decision making in different contexts to yield sometimes age differences in decision processing and behavior, and sometimes not. The second phase will be on trust-related decision making and the role of social affective signaling and learning as well. So things like how we learn to trust one another or distrust one another. And also, if you can accept the idea that we also trust non-social entities, coming to learn which are reliable predictors of positive and negative outcomes, which is a very related concept. And finally, I'm going to land on what we've been doing in the technology-mediated veracity decision space. And so this is a really new area, but I'm in a human factors and cognitive program. So what that does in the space of cognition is to think about the way that humans interact with their environments, including new digital technologies. And as you know, or I hope you do, older adults are often later adopters and are less informed and proficient about technology, which if we have critical decisions, which are often taking place through digitally mediated environments and requiring technology proficiency and understanding, we can expect that there will be age differences there as well. So we'll get into some of that. So with respect to learning memory dependence, this was a lot of what my work has done so far. And we kind of always come back to this because, as I said, because learning memory changes with age, any kind of learning or memory dependent decision making, we could expect potentially to observe age differences. And so what are those? So just as a common example, and I will cover this, if you're making a decision to buy a product or not, you might have past experiences with that product type or class. So this could be considered, sort of your brand loyalty or reputational experience, or your literal, episodic experiences, depending on whether you've used this many times or very few, or you've heard about it. You're basically integrating information over time. So, and a lot of times you'll have various kinds of decision experiences, different outcomes in the past. If the recent experience with the product was positive, but the previous two ones were negative, we want to understand how that informs choices over time, especially when we're considering the space of procedural or reinforcement-based learning compared to episodic experiences where you have like a clear memory of a past experience and how that shapes up. So to set some expectations about what we would find in this space is that aging trajectories of declarative and non-declarative memory systems are different. This is just a schematic. This is not precise and also based on some theoretical sort of schema here. But basically, you can see that non-declarative systems, including classical conditioning, priming, and perceptual learning, procedural learning, which we'll also call for our purposes reinforcement-based learning, is fairly steadily declining. It does change with age, but not in any kind of catastrophic fashion. And I believe that you've recently had guests here again, like Jaime Casteron was talking about neuromodulators. And so there's some nuanced things where, yes, dopamine declines, but it doesn't fall completely off a cliff. So it is fairly steady, and we're pretty good at doing tasks that involve these dopaminergic systems from repeated experience, including instrumental learning. Episodic and semantic memory have different trajectories and are peaking more in midlife and showing more accelerated declines. So again, if you have decision tasks that are requiring episodic memory, you can expect that those would probably be the ones that if you're looking at, for example, younger and older adults compared to one another, those will show the greatest differences. The other thing that we should set expectations for when we understand what's going to happen in the brain is that we have an awareness that the brain can compensate for age-related decline in structures that are impacted by aging. Primarily, and if anybody wants to correct me on this, they're really going to be the kinds of tasks that involve declarative processing or conscious awareness, because you have to be able to, well, the most effective way to do neural compensation is that I am going to increase my cognitive effort in the task, which means I need to be aware of what the task is asking me to do. Whereas procedural memory tasks are different, and it's harder to mount prefrontal support for those. So this is some work conducted by one of my postdoc mentors, Roberto Cabeza, who you're probably familiar with the Herald model, also scaffolding, stack, crunch models, and others that show that older adults who are higher functioning can recruit additional neural resources to do tasks that are cognitively challenging for them. Again, particularly when they're aware of the task they're doing and they can intentionally mount an enhanced response. So we've seen this across research studies. Sometimes you see additional activation recruited in the same area, such as higher magnitude within the same area in high-functioning older adults compared to young. And sometimes you see new areas of activity. But so long as they're positively predicting performance, we will call those positive neural or successful neural compensatory signals. So the hypothesis is in learning and memory dependent decision-making and aging, we'll see neural compensation in those older adults who are optimally aging, healthy, cognitively fit older adults, particularly when they rely on episodic processing in that rather than a reinforcement-based or instrumental learning type of task, because the declarative structure of the task is going to allow them to try harder to recall the events from the past and recruit neural resources to do information search in their memory retrieval. So any tasks, again, that involve episodic memory and executive function are the ones most likely to yield these compensatory signals in aging. So some years ago, when I was in my postdoc, we developed this consumer choice task, and it's a very simplistic task as our first pass at this, where we used real products from Amazon.com, and we had pairs of them that were set up in a paradigm, and participants were given a really simplistic value signal, which is simply consumer reviews noted by number of stars in there, which is a real thing that people use. I was inspired by my own Amazon search history where I'm doing product comparisons. I'm going through page after page of these products before I make a decision. It's a sequential task. I have to remember the things that I saw 5 screens ago to think, oh, is the thing that I saw 5 screens ago better than the thing that's in front of me now? When am I going to purchase this item? And so this task involves 3 levels of delay. 1, no delay at all. They're just simply comparing things which are right next to each other, which is essentially a perceptual decision. Which one has the most stars? It involves no memory whatsoever. The second one, the immediate choice condition, we're doing a 1 trial look back. So the green one here is a watch, and then the next trial is another watch. So they're just thinking it's like a 1 back, right? And then we have our longer delay condition with intervening trials. So for this one, we think that we're engaging episodic processing because, or at least we can say longer memory delays and greater memory dependence, because not only do they have several intervening trials in between, which is delay, they also made choices in between there, which is causing interference and and faster memory interference and decay. So for those, we think we should only be able to perform that task well if we have a pretty precise representation of our past experience. And recall that my expectation here is that we'll see the majority of age differences in that delay condition, and it's also a candidate for neural compensation, unlike the other conditions. And so what we find is that in these high-functioning older adults, they had accuracy similar to younger adults with similar effect on memory delays across group. This is performance. But what we were wondering is, how are these older adults able to do this pretty difficult task? Are they going to recruit additional cognitive resources? And if they do that, is it actually going to help them with the task, or it's just going to be additional activity that's not associated with successful compensation? And so what we found is that one of the primary areas that's associated with value-based decision-making, especially the representation of subjective values, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, was shown to be activated to a greater extent in older adults compared to younger adults, specifically in the condition where there's the longer delay. That is the only condition where we observe that older adults recruited additional activity to complete this task compared to young. And also that area of activity was associated with a better performance on a separate measure. So to push this a little further, we're asking, not only are they showing more activity when there's the longer delay in this decision choice task, but they're able to make the decision faster. So these are accurate trials. They had faster RTs with greater activation of the ventral medial prefrontal cortex in older adults. So this is another way for us to demonstrate this as successful neural compensation. We further examined functional connectivity in this sample to see if the ventral medial prefrontal cortex region of interest here was associated with any enhanced connectivity to other regions in the neural network. And we did find that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex region was associated with ventral medial prefrontal cortex activities, again, specifically in the condition where there's this enhanced memory dependence. And again, we want to push that a little further. Is this actually associated with better decision making? To do that, we even had another task. These are decision competence tasks. This is a decision competence comprehension task that looks at inductive and arithmetical reasoning abilities. And the second one, ability to engage in analytic over intuitive judgments. And both of those showed a positive association to our connectivity results. Again, indicating that this neural network, which is involving the ventral medial prefrontal cortex connected to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is not only assisting our participants in the task in the lab, but also on external tasks, positively associated with their ability to do these, what would be considered standard decision competent tasks in a separate survey. I also want to mention that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex region that's connected to VMP in older adults here was one of the primary areas that was activated in young adults. So this is an area that young adults use, and older adults show greater decline in DLPFC. So it makes sense that a more preserved region, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, is essentially bringing along these resources when called upon, when needed. Some other work in my lab to push this a little further to ask the question whether memory-based decisions that involve episodic memory is a lot of times where we're going to find these major age differences either in the brain or in performance. We looked at a reinforcement learning task that was shown to engage differentially the striatum and the hippocampus. So this task was created by Karin Ford and Daphna Shahami, and they were able to show in patient populations that they could find distinct neural mechanisms of reinforcement-based learning from immediate versus slightly delayed outcomes. So you have a standard reinforcement learning task, which involves a cue followed by a reward that's probabilistically associated with the cue, and people learn to select that cue, or you have a forced choice task. So they're learning about these cues, but in one condition, after they make the choice, they get the feedback right away, the outcome, the reward, and another, they have to wait 7 seconds to get it. And so what you can see in the delayed feedback, that 7-second delay condition, those with amnesic presenting, these are hippocampal patients, show that in the delayed feedback condition, very low performance if they have to wait 7 seconds for the outcome, whereas they do just fine when the feedback is immediate. And the double dissociation, when they brought in their Parkinson's disease patients, it's exactly the opposite. You might think, wow, this is really crazy that if we give them the feedback right away, they can't do the task, the Parkinson's patients here in green, but they were at floor when they're doing this associative learning, this reinforcement learning task with immediate feedback. If you ask the Parkinson's patients to wait 7 seconds, they perform as well as healthy older adult controls. Fantastic. So we want to know, do healthy older adults look more like amnesics or more like people with Parkinson's disease? There's a lot of discussion about the role of dopamine in decision-making, reward-based decision-making, and it might explain what's happening with older adults, why they might perform more poorly on some of these tasks. But my contention is that it's more in the episodic domain. It's more in the hippocampal or medial temporal lobe-based tasks that you're going to see differences by age. So just to follow up, the Ford and Shohami study also included younger adults with neuroimaging to further confirm differential engagement in the immediate and delay condition. So we were able to follow their fMRI-based protocol with our healthy older adults and young adult control subjects. And so just again, to remind you why we have this hypothesis is that these different regions, in this case, we're focusing not on the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, but on the nucleus accumbens as a primary area where we'll see the expectancy value signal, maybe not prediction error, I'm going to use your term that you suggested, Nick. These expectancy value signals in the nucleus accumbens when there's an immediate delay, and in the hippocampus when we have this slightly longer delay. But the hippocampus shows this accelerated pattern of decline compared to the nucleus accumbens. So again, that's our prediction, is that we'll see more differences when we make participants, older adults, wait just a little bit. And this is what the paradigm looks like, the immediate condition. They select their cue and they get feedback. Now, these happen to be scenes. To explain why, I wanted to also probe their memory for the outcomes. They were trained in advance as to whether indoor or outdoor scenes was associated with positive or negative outcomes, so that I could also see their memory for what happened after they made those choices, again, to further probe this memory dependence asymmetrical relationship. In the delayed condition, again, it's exactly like the immediate condition, except for after they make the choice, they have to wait 7 seconds to get their outcome. And again, those are scenes. So what we saw in terms of performance was only marginally lower reinforcement learning for immediate and delayed feedback in older adults compared to our healthy young adults. So older adults are in the dashed line here. You can see that they're slightly lower, and there's not any difference behaviorally or performance-based between the immediate and delayed condition for older adults. But, in the learning task. However, when we probed them later for their memory for those scenes that were associated with either the immediate or the delayed reward outcomes, younger adults showed greater memory for the delayed condition, which had engaged the hippocampus, so it was different, whereas the older adults showed no difference there. So they didn't get an advantage in their episodic memory for outcomes as the younger adults did in that delayed condition. And some others, have this idea of like engaging the hippocampus primes the pump for episodic memory. And so the data that we have for younger adults is consistent with that idea that if we're engaging the hippocampus in the task, then that it's ready to receive that stimulus memory and people will encode the scenes, whereas the older adults do not. So, and then in terms of our fMRI data, we found that compared to younger adults, older adults showed very similar patterns in the immediate condition. So those are the green bars here. You can see older adults and younger adults in the immediate condition. They're showing super comparable levels of expectancy value or prediction error signal, however you like to say it, in the nucleus accumbens. And here too, in the in the hippocampus, in the immediate condition, they're showing the same level. Those are the ones in green. So both younger and older adults show less hippocampal involvement in the delayed condition. But where the strange things are happening is here. So older adults in the nucleus accumbens, they're showing this differential pattern for immediate versus delayed, but in the hippocampus, they're not differentiating. So we expect to see this pattern where when we delay the outcomes, just like in young, the hippocampus should be responding to this expectancy value signal, this anticipation of reward, but rather they show nominally lower levels of activity in the hippocampus, even compared to the nucleus accumbens. So what we're seeing here is this selective impairment or decline in hippocampal-based expectancy value signals when we're doing some kind of a value-based decision task in healthy older adults. Again, behavior looking really similar. So our anticipation here is that the brain gives us information about what is declining before behavior even is affected. You might even suggest that because the nucleus accumbens is doing so much work in the in the older adults, it might be allowing them to perform this task potentially in a compensatory manner, but that remains to be determined by additional studies. So to recap on what we've done so far, for the learning and memory dependent decisions, our research has shown that the aging brain can compensate for decline in episodic memory by recruiting maintained prefrontal resources when we have memory dependent decision-making tasks. And we see selective maintenance and distinctiveness of learning signals from immediate feedback via brain resources in the striatum, but decline in signals when there's delayed feedback in the hippocampus. So moving on to the next phase, I want to talk about the role of social affective signaling. So this would be, so if we make this a social choice, in our lab, we're doing a lot of work on trust-related decision-making. So by the way, I had bangs here, and what we think better words change the look. But anyways, the color's meant to code that if you had a negative experience with me in the past and a positive experience with me in the past, what's your overall trust judgment? Are you going to engage with me in some kind of activity where you're making yourself potentially vulnerable to losses? That's like the nature of trust, right? And so again, this is an integrative function because we have to pool streams of information. And when we think about engaging in trust with others or even with non-social entities, it's usually an iterative process. It's mostly not a one shot. So in social relationships, we usually have more than one data point, although we do make snap judgments. So to study the influence of some of these social cues and social factors on trust-related decision-making in aging, we leveraged a common task, the Iowa gambling task, which we included this new social element. I don't think I have to review this for this crowd. I think people mostly know it. Yeah, no? Okay, well, I'll do a little bit of review. The Iowa gambling task uses 4 card decks that have different levels of gains and losses. Each card that's turned over gives you 2 outcomes at the same time, a gain and a loss, and they vary over the course of the task. What I really like about the Iowa gambling task is it has a lot of complexity to it. It's very difficult for participants that do this task, even at very high cognitive levels, to recall the precise history of past interactions. Just like in social relationships, we don't remember all of the details of our interactions, but we get this gist base, we get this gut sense of whether one of the decks is good or bad. And by the way, one of the things that has been used to examine this is arousal signals and these anticipatory signals detected by galvanized skin response, where before participants can even declare which deck is better than the other with any accuracy, their body will initiate a sweat signal that's detected via the finger when they're about to pick from a bad deck, because the body is knowing that this is not a good choice because of the past experience. So before we can even verbalize it, the body is knowing that, and that has to do with that affective signaling. So we adapted, just to show you that this task has been examined a lot in the context of aging, and the classic finding is that older adults don't do very well. Any task, again, that involves learning and memory, we expect older adults to potentially do worse. But again, this is a really complex task. It has, in some cases, extreme losses, which are quite rare. And we wonder whether some of those are really influencing choices, but that signal is degrading over time in individuals with cognitive decline. So we wanted to leverage this task to examine how this kind of learning to trust, if you will, decks of cards, is influenced by social signals for trustworthiness. So we developed, Marilyn Horta, one of my colleagues, she's now at Moffitt Cancer Research Institute, formerly a postdoc and grad student at University of Florida, developed these untrustworthy and trustworthy looking decks. And so, by the way, I'll say that these faces are not the real trustworthy and untrustworthy ones. We can't show those because they're protected by the participants in that study have a confidentiality agreement. So if these faces don't look that bad or good to you, that's by design. But the real ones were reliably rated as high and low in trustworthiness. And so we paired them either congruently or incongruently with these good and bad decks that led to better or worse financial outcomes over time. And we examined whether older adults were strongly influenced by the trustworthiness or untrustworthiness of the decks, both at the first instance, but also over time. And our anticipation is that because facial trustworthiness signals, these social signals, are very well preserved in aging, these are automatic kinds of information processing we have to do across our entire lives. We are social animals after all, that those will be quite influential in this learning process and potentially might put older adults at particular risk in the incongruent condition, meaning that a wolf in sheep's clothing scenario is that we have a trustworthy looking individual paired with an untrustworthy deck of cards. And we did find age-related impairments were magnified in the social context, such as the wolf in sheep's clothing. So the younger adults are here on the left. The red dashed line is a standard Iowa gambling task that involves no social stimuli whatsoever. So this is, if you look at the red, this is very similar to what we just observed from Denberg and colleagues, where younger adults learn over time to avoid the bad decks and choose the good decks, and older adults show pretty flat learning. They do get above chance, but not substantially above chance. For the congruent condition, we saw identical patterns in the younger and older adults. And this was actually kind of an interesting news flash to us, an unanticipated finding. You would think, oh, if I give you congruent social information, a trustworthy looking face with a good deck of cards, that should help you, right? In fact, it didn't. the line is flat. So basically they avoid at the beginning, both younger and older adults choosing the bad deck, which is initially associated with greater gains in the Iowa gambling task, but they don't learn. They stay flat. And so our reviewers on the paper disagreed with us a little bit about whether this would be called satisficing or not. But to me, this is indicative of satisficing, which is good enough decision making. They weren't getting big losses, so it wasn't in their interest to exert the cognitive effort necessary to figure out which is the absolute best deck. They were doing good enough decision making. Where they had to learn was in the incongruent condition. And the incongruent condition, that's the ISIGT, incongruent social. At the beginning, they're drawn into these trustworthy looking faces and they have to learn to avoid them. So this is, again, the wolf in sheep's clothing. The younger adults do that very well. Again, they don't actually get up to the level when there's no social stimuli at all. And the older adults show this more attenuated pattern. And in fact, the best they could do after 4 rounds of this game, 4 blocks of this game, was to get to 0. So what this tells us is that when we have trust-related decision-making involving these social cues of trustworthiness, older adults will rely on them. They're easy and automatic to process. They're a heuristic that's used. And in a situation where you have to learn to avoid a bad actor, they're going to be at a disadvantage. By the way, the learning curves for the incongruent condition in younger and older are not significantly different from each other. But that's not meaningless, that the fact that they start out lower. What I mean to say is that it's still a problem that older adults start out so low from the beginning, that they're so drawn in by these trustworthy looking faces, because you have to have so many levels of experience just to get to chance. And so again, our idea here is that these social cues of trustworthiness are very alluring and easily processed and will be very influential in decision making and aging. Yeah.
Just a point of clarification.
Uh-huh.
So maybe I'm misunderstanding the graph, but if both younger and older adults are relying on the social information, wouldn't you expect the concurrent stimuli to be above 0?
Yeah, that's what I said. That was a surprising finding to us. And by the way, that finding disagrees with some research that has been shown in like the trust game. So if you're familiar with the trust game, I'll actually cover that soon. The difference here is that the Iowa gambling task is a very complicated task. And our idea here is that you are better off to not have social stimuli present, because you are diluting your attentional resources to the only thing that matters, the outcome. You should not judge the book by any cover, good or bad. Pay attention to the outcomes. So the younger adults likewise appeared to show satisficing in the congruent condition. They were not assisted by having faces that were congruent with the outcomes.
Right, I guess
and we replicated this, by the way, in 2 other samples with younger adults.
I guess I'm confused why they're using it.
Sorry?
I guess I'm confused as to why they're using the social information in the incongruent trials.
Why they're using the social information? The younger adults learn to avoid it. That's the green. So at first they're drawn in by the trustworthy looking faces, but they look.
Why are they drawn in that situation?
They are when the trials are consistent. So you can tell that because in the congruent condition, they start out above. So in the Iowa gambling task, the bad decks are more alluring at the beginning because they give higher rewards. So in every case of this task, people usually start out in a deficit they have to work their way out of, because those have higher rewards. People have to learn to avoid the losses over time. So you can see that in the congruent case, they show, and by the way, these are 20 trial blocks, but if you look even on block number 1, the very first one, what do people choose more frequently? It's the trustworthy looking faces in both conditions, and it's not different. So younger adults do use the faces as well, but they show less impact of those, like the incongruent faces over time, because they're showing this stronger learning trajectory. So the point is both younger and older adults are vulnerable to the faces. And I'm not actually even making the point here that older adults are more vulnerable to the trustworthy looking faces. Our data doesn't support that they are. My point is that the consequence of that reliance on the faces is worse for older adults because of their learning deficits and the lower performance overall. they have a harder time to dig themselves out of the hole. So, I wanted to like push this a little bit further to ask the question whether this has to do with really social stimuli at all. It doesn't matter here that we're using faces. What about if we use other kinds of stimuli like valenced images that also cause biases of approach and avoidance? If we can get stimuli, like I've shown here in our non-social condition, these are IAPS pictures that are positively and negative valence, and put them into another kind of trust decision-making or trust learning paradigm, can we basically get the same findings, or does it matter? Are faces in this context special? And so we used an iterative multi-round trust game here. And by the way, this study has only been done with younger adults to this point. I do want to extend it to older, but I just first wanted to ask the question, even in young, are faces special in this context, or can we get the same exact effect on both initial bias, learning, and memory if we use valence photos that are rated at the same level of trustworthiness and untrustworthiness? So we did that. This paper was recently published. My student Jordan Schatz led this project, and we actually have two versions of this non-social condition. We again used, this is the FACES database with my colleague Natalie Ebner. And again, these are not the trustworthy and untrustworthy looking ones. We can't show you those for reasons specific to that database. But in the non-social condition, we used some really simplistic stimuli that have red and green backgrounds to trigger these approach avoidance feelings. And then in the second version of the experiment, we used the valence pictures, which were a little more explicitly positive and negative. And we paired those with conditions in the trust game where participants are given an amount of money that they can give to their partner. In the social condition, they were deceived to believe that another person is playing the game with them, and they had picked that photo to represent themselves in the game. In the non-social condition, they were told, you're playing with a computer and nothing about the picture. This is just a wallpaper background so that you can identify them differently. And what we found, so first of all, we confirmed that in the trustworthy looking condition, both social and non-social, they were rated as higher in trustworthiness and no different across the social and non-social conditions. So in terms of their perceptions of trustworthiness, social and non-social were the same, controlled, and the untrustworthy looking ones, the computers and the faces here, were rated as the same. And over time, what we saw is similar effects on the investment behavior for the the trustworthy and untrustworthy cues in both the social and non-social learning conditions. Interestingly, people trust more the non-social condition, the computer. So you can see that, and this was across both of our experiments, we replicated that in the non-social condition, people invested more in the computer than in the social partner. This also says something about norms for fairness. It says something about the fact that this game always involved a condition with 80% reciprocity. So you might think, if I have a friend who's mean to me 20% of the time, they're not that great of a friend. So they might have been punishing those people a little bit, even in the 80% condition. But nonetheless, the overall patterns of learning were not very different, and the visual cue effects weren't very different either. Where we did see differences, where we considered faces to be a bit special, is in the memory domain. Again, back to memory, an episodic memory. So then we're looking at asking them after the experiment is done, these are the partners you played with. These are their images. What would you say about your trustworthiness of that individual now, or that computer now? And what we saw is a special effect here in the perceived trustworthiness for encountered partners, where in the social version of the task, those who looked untrustworthy and acted more untrustworthy were rated as significantly lower in untrustworthiness compared to the computer condition. So again, they were using those faces at that point, and there was no difference in the outcomes that occurred. The reciprocity rates were identical. Everything was controlled. But they basically were saying that untrustworthy looking person who treated me badly is more untrustworthy than the computer that gave me the exact same outcomes and had a negative cue in the task. For the reciprocity rates, we also saw that we asked them, well, how many times do you think your partner reciprocated with you? And we saw that there was greater distinctiveness on that in the social condition here on the left than in the non-social condition on the right. Again, it was particular to the low trustworthiness condition. So the partners that only reciprocated 20% of the time, they basically said, you are less trustworthy, you reciprocated less. And actually it was quite accurate. It was right on the 20% line. But in the non-social condition, they weren't as good. They inflated a little bit and didn't have such a strong negative opinion. So in summary here, even if we consider these social cues to be irrelevant, if there's social emotional cues that are involved in trust-related learning and decision-making, they can affect decision processing, both in younger and older adults, but particularly in the context of aging, we are concerned that it could lead to initial biases that can require reversal learning, which we know that older adults really struggle with. We see little evidence, surprisingly, that these social affective visual cues can facilitate outcome probability learning and enhance decision making. In fact, you're better off to say, cover your eyes entirely, just pay attention to the outcomes, because anything more than that is compromising their attention. And finally, non-social visual cues can bias decision making. Faces are naturally salient in trust-related contexts and might have relatively greater impact on memory, although in terms of like trial by trial learning about these trust-related relationships and outcome probabilities, we don't see major evidence of that. Okay, in my little bit of remaining time, I want to talk about work that we're doing in this technology-mediated decision-making space. Most of this is ongoing work, primarily in our research project that's funded by the Florida Department of Health. And so, but this is actually a student project, one of my graduate students did, looking at whether trust with an anonymous social partner or visible remote social partners is any different from making decisions in real life with one another using like confederates. So just to set expectations on this one, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're well aware, research been done for many, many years of this concept of the digital divide, that older adults are later adopters of every kind of technology. You can say, oh, they have the internet, they have smartphones, yes. But any novel technology that is invented, it's always adopted more by younger people. This is a really consistent finding. And you can see for various kinds of novel technologies, internet, home broadband, smartphone, tablet, social media, those who are above 50, 70, 60, 90 are always at the, these are younger adult adoption rates. These are all adults versus those 65 are always at a lower rate. And the newer the technology is, the less likely older adults will have both experience with it, efficacy with it, proficiency, and use it regularly. I also want to mention that one of my grad students was looking into what are the predictors of technology use and proficiency, including novel technologies. And the factors that came up over and over again were some of these memory ones. We did 2 different studies on this, one on machine learning, where we predicted using health and retirement study data, the top predictors using a competitive class. We had over 250 independent variables, put it into our machine learning algorithms to see what are the top predictors. And delayed recall was one of the top predictors of internet use in older adults, even in today's era. And we attribute that to probably the low end of the spectrum. People with very poor episodic memory are really not using any kind of newish technology. They may have Alzheimer's disease or something else. Whereas with novel technologies, one of the top predictors is short-term memory. So in the HRS data set, we find that people that use things like streaming services, telehealth, rideshare apps, the ones who use those and have high digital technology proficiency are those who have the highest levels of performance on short-term memory tasks. And why do we care about this? Digital technology is definitely a vehicle for threats. We know that by the number of people victimized in online environments and in the dollar amount that they lose, older adults are at enhanced risk. So my graduate student conducted a really carefully designed economic decision-making task using one-shot dictator game. She manipulated partner physical presence and visibility to examine whether people will make different decisions with a social partner if they are in a remote space versus with them in person, and whether they can see them or not, see their physical facial features or not. And so she included, this is my first pass at having senior research assistants in the lab. They were matched to our younger adults in some of their physical attributes, and we had age-matched confederates for this study to ensure high ecological validity. And what we found is that on average, and this has been found in other studies, offers were higher in older age, but also with physical presence and visibility. None of that is too interesting, I would say. What I found really interesting in the context of age-related decision-making is that the older adults, specifically when the engagement with a social partner was virtual, whether it was anonymous or they could see them on the screen, they took longer to make those decisions, and they were quite fast, faster than younger adults, when those interactions were in person. So older adults seem to process those opportunities to invest in their social partner through this game really quickly and easily when they were in person, again, whether they could see them or they were behind a partition. But in the virtual space, they took longer. And importantly, specifically in the virtual anonymous condition, that delay to make the decision was associated with greater investments. So they were behaving generously and socially normatively, but they required that extra time to make their intended decision. So it tells us that older adults, again, when they're in virtual spaces, perhaps because of lack of comfort and experience, might require more time to make some of these important trust-related decisions. And I'll just land on one last thing. One of the things that our lab is looking at is different kinds of methods of deception, whether they're conducted in in-person spaces, virtual spaces, whether they involve these facial social stimuli, bodies, voices, and really rich social communication versus really limited social communication, something just like a face. My former postdoc, Sheng Wang, was working on this project and showing, like trying to link this up to some existing theory, so fuzzy trace theory, showing that because older adults have less of this sort of verbatim memory and rely more on gist, when we have different kinds of deception that rely on familiarity, like AI, we should expect that we're going to see some specific vulnerability in aging. Whereas when we have the ability to verify information more, older adults might actually show effects that are similar to young and might be able to dissociate these things, the true and the untrue stimuli. And so just so that you're aware, things like AI-based deepfake faces, they rely on similarity. They're basically gathering faces from all around the internet and making them look really familiar. So if you are processing things based on gist and familiarity, you're going to believe that AI-based faces are real. And indeed, we find that for our AI-based deepfakes, but also Lighthall that involves real humans pleading their case for some kind of family member who's gone missing, and in half of the cases, those cases were adjudicated to be a true pleading case versus a lie. You can see that here. Accuracy in our both healthy older adults and MCI is about at chance. So it's showing again this particular vulnerability in aging to any time when we have like facial social stimuli that can convey these feelings of trust, this automatically processed information. And again, that is whether they're real human actors or whether they are AI-based deepfakes. And importantly here, I want you to pay attention to this lie task and our deepfake task. That response bias indicates not only is their performance at chance, but they're biased to call those stimuli true. Both in the case of real liars who were caught out saying that my kid has been kidnapped and I don't know what happened to them, but actually they were the one who abducted the child. So these are real adjudicated cases, and the AI-based deepfakes. In both cases, older adults who are healthy and those with MCI tend to believe what is on the screen in front of them. Test is our email-based phishing task. In that case, we see skepticism. So it's selective. So this is actually a domain where we think interventions like education could help older adults perform better at things like email-based phishing tasks because they actually do the task rather well. And then fake news, we saw the highest level of performance. This is the only task where there's any indication of a difference, by the way, between people with MCI and healthy cognitive controls. And PEST, again, showed rather good sensitivity. But both the live task and the deepfake, anything where there's faces involved, are very difficult to discern, and people have a bias for truth, both older adults and those with MCI. So to recap that last bit there, lower experience with technology among older adults and AI tools that leverage familiarity to deceive people can put older adults at risk for exploitation. These are the kind of tools that I am most concerned about anything that involves pleading, social affective signaling. Older adults are very sensitive to these things. They process them very well, and they feel true. They feel real. And by the way, these AI-based tools are excellent, and they're getting better every day. Maintain cognition and education, including digital literacy, could potentially be protected, but we think that the most protective outcomes for those would be in the case of things like fake news and email-based phishing, where training seems to have more ability to impact performance. And older adults make trust-related decisions with others faster when the person is in person versus virtual. And oh, I didn't finish that thought. And deception involving social stimuli, such as liars, is one of our primary concerns because of this truth bias that we see. Finally, veracity of written information with greater detail, like fake news and email phishing, is relatively easier to discern and aging. With that, I want to thank my collaborators, my lab, and my funders again, and thank you all for your attention.
So given the results of your familiarity task with the third section, I'm curious if you noticed any gender differences in the Iowa gambling task, the facial Iowa gambling task, and did women rate women as more trustworthy, or did men rate men as more trustworthy?
There is definitely gender effects that happen there. So I should mention that as a control for that, we always keep the gender of the face the same within. So in the case of the trust game, it has very few faces. You're only playing with a few partners. So there we would have only female faces, for example. In other tasks where we have lots of faces involved, like in the AI-based deepfake ones, we have gender balanced. People trust women more. So whenever the face is female, they're more inclined to trust. In the study that you saw with the older adults, those I think were only female faces. Because we wanted that to be balanced, and also because we were trying to play on this idea of getting that initial trust thing. But we've done it with male faces as well, where that was controlled. In terms of the gender outcome when based on the participants' gender, we also see that females have a stronger response to facial trustworthiness. I haven't actually looked at this in older adults, but I have looked at it in younger adults across samples, and that is true. So if you don't care about that factor, you should control it. If you do care about that factor, it might actually be a predictor of interest. So, and I can see a lot of evolutionary reasons why women might be more sensitive to some of the threatening characteristics of social partners. It's a good question. Yeah.
That older adults are slower to catch up to the technologies, and even for younger adults, it's kind of hard to tell the difference between AI ages. Wondering if you were to train or teach help the older adults and AI patients helps you recognize an AI image, but we still see that trustworthiness level, so we doesn't have it.
So the short answer and my strong belief is we should not waste our energy on that training. People are doing this, but they're going to get nominal increases in performance. The problem is the tech is getting better every single day. So we're just chasing our tail, in my opinion. I think that when it comes to AI-based deepfakes, by the way, we use static images, but you should see some of the AI-based deepfakes that are video now, very convincing. And again, they get better every single day. So I think for those, the way we need to intervene is technologically and via policy. I don't think that we're going to be able to do that, but I do have a colleague who's working on that. And one of the factors that they say is things like facial symmetry. AI-based deepfakes, again, because they're using averaging, the faces are more symmetrical, they're more attractive. So those should be some of the cues, but it's going to get you 5% better performance. And then the algorithm is going to get better and you're going to lose that. So I think for that. Now, do I think that training on some of these other tasks could be worthwhile? Absolutely. I think educational intervention and digital literacy for things like anything that involves, so I was just discussing with Lulu this morning that we need reliable red flags. If you think about it, whether a face is trustworthy or not, whether it's real or not, we don't have ground truth. In order for us to learn what is reliably good or bad, we need feedback, right? We have to train our own brains. And how often in life do we get that feedback? Almost never. But if we have a news story that involves presumed facts and we can debunk even one of them, we can reject the whole thing, right? And so we can teach people to find reliable red flags. It depends on the kind of stimuli, and a face doesn't have that many reliable red flags in the era of AI.
I just wanted to follow up on that. What is the evidence that people, there are two things. Firstly, what is the agreement between individuals on the trustworthiness of faces, the reliability of those judgments across people? Secondly, what's the evidence that there's any validity? That is, do faces that get judged to be untrustworthy belong to untrustworthy people?
Right.
So the thinking is, firstly, if these things are not particularly consistent, I guess there will be some consistency.
Yes.
But the other point is, if there's no correlation between judged trustworthiness and true trustworthiness, then the best thing to do is tell people pay no attention to your.
And by the way, I completely agree. So
Yeah.
let me answer your questions one by
Yeah,
one.
sure.
The first thing is, do people agree that these stimuli,
Yeah.
including the non-social ones, and the faces are trustworthy or not? They are consistent. And we try when we can to pick those which are at the greater extremes of the rating scale through normed data. So we select our stimuli based on external norming studies. Then we have them in the lab and we ask our own participants so that we confirm that that's in agreement with our conditioning. Okay, so that's set. We're good there. Should people use them? No,
There's no relationship
No.
at all.
no, no. So again, why do people trust women more? Well, facial characteristics that look like softer are those which are trust more, like a child. Can we trust children? Usually. Some of them are terrible. But most of them aren't trying to exploit you for all of your earthly possessions. Actually, maybe take that back. Some of them are trying to.
But they are fundamentally unreliable.
Yes, you're totally right. So but I will put the point on it that I'm examining the world that is, which is people use these things. Whether they're right or wrong, they definitely use them in the real world. And so the educational intervention, to your point, should be, you should not be using these social cues of attractiveness and all of these things. Because by the way, attractiveness is intrinsically associated with trustworthiness too.
Yeah.
So yes, absolutely. In interpersonal decision-making, we should help people to downplay their reliance on physical. We should teach them to focus on the outcomes. But can we be totally successful in that? I don't think so, because these signals are processed. So it's the first things that we know how to identify when we're born is a face. The most basic low-res signals. So it's really hard to turn it off.
So these are cultural norms. So one would assume that in some other cultures, different facial features signal trustworthiness versus non-trustworthiness. There's no basis in our experience other than through films, through models, etc.
I think they're fairly universal. I do think that some of those characters, so for example, one of the feature is a heavy brow. Why would that be? So in ecology, it would be something like a heavy brow means I can't see your eyes, or it's more in the shape of a furrow. And if your brow is furrowing, that means you're not giving me an open, receptive, positive facial expression. Does that have validity to it? In a facial expression, it does. Because a big, wide open face means you trust me. You don't expose your eyes to a conspecific if you can't trust them. All species are this way that have forward-facing eyes. They protect their eyes when they don't trust or when they're trying to threaten another one. So it has these elements to realness, but if it's your facial shape, yes, you can't really change it.
So would it be fair to say that this is just a distractor from the outcomes?
Yeah.
And that would be almost as similar, like when you look at the internet or whatever, the third part, it's like going into familiarity and the gist. Again, you discount the evidence, you discount the outcome, you go into something that doesn't value as much, the evidence doesn't value as much than what's actually in front of you. In a way, it's all part of a similar idea that we have this tag between trying to be able to divert this extensive processing power
Yeah.
to count all this versus you can kind of get shortcuts. And this is an easy shortcut to, or like it's prominent salient shortcut to kind of discount a little bit of what's happening.
Yeah.
And it distracts it. Like we're
Yeah, I mean, heuristics exist for a reason. They're mostly helpful. They're mostly right and true. And that's why otherwise we wouldn't use them as a culture. But yeah, to your point, I mean, what it really hits home for me, especially with the undergrad data and the facial stimuli version of the Iowa gambling task, is how little additional information we can add into our decision processing and get to the correct answer. I would think they can do better than that, at least comparable to the condition where there's no faces whatsoever. No. It hurts their performance. Now, I will say, I mentioned that others have done this, and again in my lab too. The trust game is a much simpler task than the Iowa gambling task because you play with one partner at a time. Your partner, if you're the investor, can only either reciprocate your investment or fail to reciprocate. So when you're thinking about tracking that over time, they do that rather well. And they could probably tell you, and my data shows that in the case where they reciprocate 20% of the time, in the social condition, they're exactly right. They guessed it exactly right. They know. And so in that situation, those facial cues are, we would hope that they could help you a little bit. Again, they don't really. But they don't hurt you tremendously, is the opposite of it. They do learn to avoid them.
I would just point out that in all of these scenarios, the facial cues are contrived, but in the real world, facial cues have meaning and they're conveying information.
Especially emotional expressions.
Yeah.
And by the way, some of our new work is using dynamic facial expression changes. So we have an experiment we're working on with some computer science colleagues where it's another one of the digital ones where people are playing on a computer, but they're being recorded and they're having their facial expressions monitored. And they're told that they're being broadcast to a partner in another room. And we show them dynamically changing faces in that case. So they have emotional expressions in that case. It's not just the facial dynamics. And that study already showed that when your partner shows a face of disgust after one of your actions, it triggers you to make more investments on the following trial. So that's a specific social emotion, disgust coming from things like, gustatory processing, but in the case of moral decision making and so on, it's related to, I don't agree with what you just did. I don't think that your behavior was ethical or correct. So I know we're over time, but I appreciate all the questions.
Are there any questions online?
There are no questions online.
Thank you.
Okay.